Okay, Micro Unit 4, Introduction to Perfect Competition. Let me show you where we're going in this unit. To do that, I'm going to bring you back to this circular flow diagram that we saw back in Unit number 1. And you remember this is a simplistic view of how market systems work. So you'll remember there are businesses and households, and we interact with each other in two places, the resource market and the product market. Well, over the next 3 units, we're going to be looking really hard at this green rectangle down here, the product market. Remember that this is where households are the buyers and businesses are the sellers. This is any place where we as consumers buy goods and services from businesses. So we're going to look at how businesses make their decisions down in this product market, how they decide things like what price to charge, what quantity to produce, and etc. Now, we're actually going to divide that box up into 4 different kinds of models. And the reason for that is that it's impossible to actually analyze every specific business. So instead, what economists do is group businesses into 4 different market models, 4 different types of industries, based primarily on how much competition exists in those industries. So over the next number of units, we're going to be looking at these 4 different market models. And we're going to kind of put them on a spectrum. On one side of the spectrum, we're going to have perfect competition or pure competition, and that's what we're going to study in this unit. On the other extreme, we're going to see something called the monopoly. Now, you can think of pure competition as lots and lots of competition, lots and lots of businesses in a particular business competing against each other. If that's the case, then a monopoly is no competition, one business in an industry. In between, we're going to see 2 kinds of imperfect competition. If perfect competition is on the left-hand side and no competition is on the right-hand side, then we have something in between in the middle. And there's going to be 2 market models in there. We're going to call them monopolistic competition and oligopolies. Now in class we'll do a little activity to try to describe exactly what each of these market models are. But for now we're going to be focusing on pure competition. We're going to do that in this unit. In the next unit, we're going to move to monopolies. And in the unit that follows, we're going to cover the 2 kinds of imperfect competition, monopolistic competition and oligopoly. All right, so let's start talking about what pure or perfect competition is. This is a market model or an industry where, first off, there are very, very large numbers of both buyers and sellers. So lots of competition and lots of people to sell things to. By very large numbers, I mean hundreds or thousands of firms. The second thing you need in order to have a perfectly competitive market model is a standardized product. And what that means is that each firm in that industry is selling exactly the same thing. Think about like a wheat farmer, right? I don't know that much about farming because I'm from the Bronx, but my understanding is that wheat is basically wheat. And one wheat farmer's wheat is another wheat farmer's wheat. They're selling exactly the same thing. Third characteristic of perfect competition, free entry and exit. In other words, this has to be a kind of business that's really easy to get into and really easy to get out of. There are no barriers to entry. So for example, if you wanted to own your own airline company, that's a pretty big barrier to entry. You need probably millions or billions of dollars to start up that kind of company. Hard to get into. On the other hand, if you want to be like a cucumber farmer, that's pretty easy to get into. Go get yourself some seeds, some dirt, some water for a few bucks. You can be a cucumber farmer. And if you want to stop being a cucumber farmer, it's easy to stop as well. All right, fourth characteristic of perfect competition, the firms are price takers. What that means is that they actually have no control over the price they charge. And that's going to take a little explanation, so we'll get to that in a second. And then finally, I should mention that this is an ideal market model, and I mean that in two senses of the word. It's ideal in the sense that from society's perspective, as we're going to see, we want industries to be perfectly competitive. It has all sorts of societal benefits. The more competition, the better it is for society. It's also ideal in the sense that there aren't very many actual real examples of perfect competition in the real world. There are a couple, and I'll talk about what those are. But I want you to think of this as essentially what we're aiming for in terms of a market model in a free market system. And to the extent we get away from this kind of market model, society is going to lose out in various ways. All right, so with that behind us, let's talk a little bit more about what it means to be a price taker, and specifically what the demand curve is going to look like if you're a perfectly competitive firm. We're going to distinguish between the industry as a whole, which I might call the market, and one individual business. Now, what we're going to see is that in terms of the industry, let's say the apple industry or the wheat industry, the demand curve is going to look normal. It's going to obey that law of demand. It's going to be a downward sloping demand curve, just like we've seen up to this point. But what we're going to see is that for an individual firm, at least from their perspective, demand looks very different. In fact, it's going to look like a perfectly horizontal line, a perfectly elastic demand curve. And that's what it means to be a price taker, as we're going to see. All right, so to kind of set up the model and what the graphs look like, again, we're going to divide things into two graphs. On the left-hand side, we're going to have a graph for the entire industry, maybe the Apple industry. And on the right-hand side, I'm going to have a graph for one individual firm, one perfectly competitive firm in that industry. Now, as I said, in the industry graph, things look familiar. Supply and demand, with demand looking like a normal downward sloping demand curve. And what we're going to see is that it's the industry that determines equilibrium price and quantity. If we're talking about bushels of apples, and this is where the supply and demand curves in the industry, the equilibrium price of a bushel might be $131. That seems a bit high, but let's just go with it. The equilibrium quantity in the industry might be 1 million bushels of apples. Now, I want you to picture what perfect competition would actually look like. Remember, it's an ideal model, but think about what it would look like if we actually had it. Let's say that this is you. You're an apple farmer, and let's say you set up your little stand of apples on some field or in some farmer's market. You're thinking about what price you want to charge, and I want to show you why it is exactly that you're a price taker, why you have to basically take the price from the industry, market, supply, and demand curves. Now, to understand this, what you have to picture is what perfect competition would actually look like. Remember, there are hundreds or thousands of sellers who are all selling exactly the same thing as you. And let's say they're all charging the price that's illustrated in that industry supply and demand graph. Let's say they're all charging a price of $131. So they're all selling exactly the same thing as you, and there's thousands of them, right? You're trying to decide what price you're going to charge for your apples. Well, if you tried charging a price of $132, for pretty obvious reasons, it wouldn't work. Nobody would buy from you, because if you put that little sign of $132 on your apples, people would just go right next door to any number of hundreds or thousands of other sellers that are selling exactly the same thing as you, but they're selling it for $131. So $132 or any price above market price simply won't work because nobody would buy from you. On the other hand, you might think to yourself, well, why don't I charge a lower price so I can sell more, maybe $130? Now, you could charge that price, but if you think about it, it wouldn't make sense to, because you're part of that market supply, and you can sell as much or as little of your apples as you want to at the market price. Because remember, you're part of that supply curve. And what this graph is showing is that at equilibrium, at a price of $131, the market's going to clear. Every one of those apples is going to sell. You're part of that million quantity of apples. So you could charge a price lower than $131, but there's really no reason to, since you can clear your market and sell all your apples at the going market price. What that means is that you're pretty much forced into a price of $131, the market price. And that's what it means to be a price taker. You really have no control over the price that you charge. You can't get away with charging a price higher than the market price, and it just wouldn't make sense to charge any price lower than the market price. You're a price taker. All right, well, with that in mind, let's start building what the graph looks like for one individual firm. And we'll start with price. Being a price taker means that you have to take the price from the market, and this is going to be true throughout perfect competition. So in terms of the price that a perfect competitor charges, what we're going to do is go to equilibrium in the supply and demand graph. We're going to pull that price over to the individual firm's graph, and we're going to label that as P, the price, $131. You can sell 1 apple, you can sell 100 apples at that market price. Alright, well, it turns out that this little horizontal line that we just drew is a few other things too for a perfectly competitive firm. And to see what they are, I have to introduce you to 2 new formulas and remind you of one old formula. The old formula is total revenue, which you'll remember is equal to price times quantity. It's all the money flowing into the cash register. That's the old formula. The first new formula is called average revenue, abbreviated AR, and it's equal to total revenue divided by quantity. Think of average revenue as the money received for each unit sold. Take all the money coming in, divide it by the quantity, and that tells you how much money you're getting for each unit. You also might come to the conclusion that it's the same thing as price. Look at the formula. And it in fact is. In fact, throughout the next 3 units, we can equate price and average revenue. They're basically synonyms of each other. The next new formula is called marginal revenue. And again, here's another marginal in this class. Marginal revenue is the change in total revenue divided by the change in quantity. Conceptually, it's how much additional money is going to go into the cash register if you sell 1 additional unit. And this, along with marginal cost, as we've seen in the last unit, are the 2 most important marginals in all of microeconomics. We're going to be using them constantly, so it's important to understand what they are and how you calculate them. Alright, well, let's think about what demand would look like and what these variables would look like for a perfectly competitive firm. Remember, a perfectly competitive firm is a price taker, maybe a price of $131. So in the first column, I have price, and I've also labeled it average revenue because they're the same thing. In the second column, I have quantity demanded, or different quantities that this firm might sell. Third column says total revenue. Fourth column says marginal revenue. Well, starting off with a quantity of 0, if you sell 0 units at a price of $131, total revenue will be 0, 0 times 131. Marginal revenue is irrelevant at this point because it's a change figure and we haven't changed anything yet. So let's go to our first unit. If we sell 1 unit at, again, a price of $131, total revenue would be $131, which would be $131 more than selling 0 units. This change in total revenue is equal to marginal revenue. If we sold 2 units, again, the price doesn't change. We're a price taker, $131. 2 times 131 is 262. That would be total revenue. Marginal revenue would be, again, 131 because 262 is 131 more than 131. We can keep going on this way, selling 3 bushels of apples, 4 bushels of apples, 10 bushels of apples, etc. Now you might notice some things about some of these numbers, but let me make them explicit. Let's do that by graphing out a few of these columns. Alright, well, let's start off with price. We actually don't need to start off with price because we've already graphed price. Notice that no matter what the quantity is, from 0 to 10, price never changes. This is, again, part of this price taker role. So when we graphed price, it looked like this. The straight line at $131, we called it price. If we wanted to graph out average revenue, it would look exactly the same, because remember, price and average revenue are exactly the same thing. So when we graph out average revenue, we get this same line. Average revenue, same thing as price. Now, most importantly, what if we tried to graph out the demand curve? Remember what a demand curve is: a series of possible prices and a corresponding series of quantities. In fact, when we graph out this demand curve, it turns out to be exactly that same horizontal line. And this is what I was talking about when I said that an individual firm in perfect competition has a perfectly flat or elastic demand curve. Because no matter what quantity it wants to produce, the price never changes. Back when you learned about elasticity, some of you asked me, what would possibly represent a perfectly elastic demand curve? When would we possibly see it? Well, here's where we see it. In an individual firm dealing in perfect competition. All right, finally, when we graph out marginal revenue against a series of possible quantities, notice the numbers again. Marginal revenue is the same thing as this line as well. So for a perfectly competitive firm, in the individual graph, marginal revenue, demand, average revenue, price, they're all exactly the same thing. They're this horizontal line. And a little shortcut to remembering this, there's a little acronym you can use to always label this graph the right way. All right, going to stop it there, but as we go on, we're going to continue on building this graph and building this model. Each screencast in this unit kind of builds upon each other, so make sure you understand one before you move on to the next.